Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are going to be talking about the rules you need to understand if you're going to create beautiful designs that have nice hierarchy, nice layout, and all of that. So let's jump right in. So I think one of the things people forget often is that we know how to create a grid and we need to really know how to actually use it. A lot of people just create the grid and don't use it properly. These are going to be some guidelines. So let's jump in. Elements must sit on some number of columns. So right here, we do have the elements all sitting on those columns. You'll notice that we even have grids within some of our items here, which is another practice that you can, get into if you really want to get down to the nitty gritty of like that type of layout. With auto layout these days, it's not so big of an issue, but when it comes to like the main grid, I would say that, you focus on keeping everything on this really large grid here. Now, your elements must sit on the grid. You can split them up in any which way you want. You notice I'll have like 3 in this like row here, but it must actually sit on that grid. It can't come into over here and rest on top of that column. Now, the other thing I often find is that sometimes people kind of ignore that and they let the content sit in like gutters. It's the same kind of concept. We need to actually have that content over here aligned with that grid. You'll see that kind of rule pop up, that red rule over there. That is where they need to sit, and I would definitely not move it. And if you notice that maybe your content gets a little too close to one another, and say like you have this frame over here, and let's just hide our grids. So we have this frame over here, and if our content didn't, expand within that frame, there's issues where they're very close. Now we have this frame, and we can create like these little cards that give things a little bit more breathing room. We can have a little bit, a little bit more extra breathing room on either side, and that will basically allow you to, even though this text isn't necessarily resting on top of the columns as like I am illustrating, it is definitely resting within the columns of this card. And also like the entire card or the parent card is the one that's on the actual element. So definitely remember that. And, I'm going to build off of this a bit. This is going to just apply to the parent container. There'll be times where you want to customize a card or the content within it, and it may not really adhere to that grid at all, like I mentioned just prior. It may be that the image is in the gutter or your text is wrapping to accommodate something else. And this is fine as long as the parent container, like this card, is on that grid within the columns, as you see here. This is an example of just like a card on a column, but you shouldn't really place it like this without anything beside it, because this brings me to my next point here. Now, your outside columns are not for padding. That's just not how it works. It may be that, the width of the content is just like either too wide or too small, and you're doing these dynamic layouts, and it does have its place, don't get me wrong, but it will have an outside margin. And when you scale down, like your layout's going to have that outside margin. And when you scale down, your margin can be adjusted to give you more space on each end. So if you're definitely use breakpoints if you need more padding. So an example is you can do these purposeful layouts where, things are staggered and there's like, 2 column spacing on either side or how many pixels you need. That's fine. But if you find that, okay, I need more padding on either side here and I want this to be centered, I think the goal here is to, make this a whole section and then center that content inward and keep it very consistent. Don't just like do it, as a one-off thing. You see how like this is kind of like all over the place. It doesn't really allow our eyes to kind of flow naturally through it. And that's just not how, it's going to naturally work in the real world. You're going to have the developer that you need to really work closely with to figure out, what sections are going to be like these components where I'm going to have like 40 pixel or 120 pixels spacing on the right here, and then it's going to stagger. It just gets things unnecessarily really complex. It just makes a really big mess of things. So I try to keep it very consistent and very easy for everyone that's going to be implementing my designs. You have to think about your developers too. Now, one of the last things I do want to bring up are full bleed elements. Now, you will design websites, you probably already have, and you will have like these massive hero pages where they're just going to bleed right off of your actual columns, and that's fine. Your full bleed elements can go beyond your grid and stretch to the edge, your frame over here. Artboard, frame, canvas, whatever you'd like to call this area. It's just a frame, but it can stretch right across to the edge. And that's about it. Nothing else is going to be able to stretch beyond that. You notice how this is still on that grid over here. It's kind of hard to see, but the navigation is still there. The text is still there. The button is just kind of like centered, and that's fine. But this container is like beyond that grid. So that's it. You're good to go off and actually use the grids that we designed. Go start using them to build some of our next designs and keep them handy, because that's what we're going to definitely use. And I would say try and create your own grid and keep going.